Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for your patience. My name's Gabby and I am part of the sales team here at Coral Expeditions. We were just waiting a few extra minutes for a few latecomers. I think we've still got a few joining in, so thanks everybody. So today our webinar is obviously on South Australia. So thanks for taking the time to join us and learn all about South Australia's beautiful coastline. This webinar is being recorded today and we will send a recorded version to everybody that has registered today out after we have completed this webinar. We'll have a question and answer section at the end of the webinar as well. And if we don't happen to get to your question, that's okay. We will respond to it in writing after today's presentation. All right, let's get started. Okay, perfect. So today we're going to run you through 3 fantastic itineraries. Sorry, looks like my screen's just frozen there. There we go. 3 fantastic itineraries that are going to visit Australia's islands and rugged coastlines, which I believe are some of Australia's best kept secrets along Australia's coastline. And we will have a special guest speaker joining us today, Quentin, who I believe is online. Can you hear us, Quentin? Might be there. Oh, he's going to join us in later today anyway. So he's going to tell you all about those beautiful spots along South Australia's coastline.
I'm here now.
Oh, great. Thanks, Quentin. I knew you were there somewhere. We'll introduce you in just a few moments. So for those of you that are new to Coral Expeditions, I'm just going to run through before we get on to Quentin and the incredible itineraries, a bit about expedition cruising and what Coral Expeditions is all about. Alrighty, guys, let's get started. So for almost 40 years now, Coral Expeditions, we've always been operating with a single purpose, which is to take small groups of like-minded explorers to remote places with expert guidance and warm Australian hospitality. So expedition cruising. Now, expedition cruising is for travellers seeking a more intimate adventure on smaller ships into remote destinations, which are inaccessible by a lot of those larger cruise lines. So due to our vessel's smaller size, guests on board the expedition cruise, they can look forward to no queues, which means no wait time, greater opportunity to experience a destination with more time ashore, and a far more authentic experience and journey. So on board our vessels, we encourage a natural Australian style service and an open interaction between our guests and crew. So it's one where you can watch your dinner being prepared in our open galleys by our chefs, or you can go into the bridge and have a chat with the captain, or just simply sit back and relax in the company of experienced guest lecturers and other like-minded travellers on board. So included in the cruise, you will get beautiful, fresh, chef-prepared meals on board, and you will get selected wines, beers, juices, and soft drinks, and some spirits included with your lunch and dinner service. And we do have a tea and coffee station, which is available at any time as well. You will also have access to our fantastic, knowledgeable guest lecturers and our amazing expedition team on board. So Coral Expeditions, we were one of the first cruise operators to employ interpretive guides on our cruises, which is a tradition that continues today. So each trip you'll find it includes a mix of our full-time guest lecturers and they join the expedition team, and special guest lecturers who are chosen specifically for their local knowledge depending on the regions that we're visiting. So these guys, they immerse our guests on the unique wildlife and the environments that we're visiting, and that's really what expedition cruising is all about. It's a learning, educational, immersive experience. So with our expedition team, they provide local expertise with a strong understanding of the unique landscapes, the flora and fauna and Indigenous cultures of the regions that we visit. And our passionate expedition leaders, they're on board and take our guests and you on every excursion. So we don't hand over to the land-based tour companies, we're with you the whole way. We focus on more time ashore with 2 excursions daily where possible. Now, with the shore excursions, we generally have 2 options. So this will vary from an easy coastal flat beach walk, or it might be something with more of an inclined steep hill up to a nice viewing point where you get the heart rate up, or as I said, you can just simply go for a nice stroll along the beach. So we do always have a couple of options and we cater for all different fitness levels. Now, with our shore excursions, we run them on these explorer tenders, which you can see in the image here. These are purpose-built for our shore excursions. We like to call them the safari jeeps of the sea. So how they operate is basically they're set up on the back of our ships, and you can just step onto the tenders and you'll be lowered down to the water in under 5 minutes. We can seat the full ship's capacity on board as well. So we can put 72 people in each tender. So we have 2 tenders on our larger ships and 1 on our smaller vessel. So basically, as you can see in the image, guys, all open sides. We do have clears that will come down if we do have some bad weather that we come into. So open view for all passengers. They are designed for guest comfort as well. So we have padded seats, roof for the weather protection. There is an onboard toilet as well. And then there is a front ramp, so suitable for beach landings. We do come across a few wet and dry landings. So it's just a ramp that comes down the front and you just simply walk on and off. With your footwear, we obviously recommend that you've got something that can be worn in the water. So those wet sort of reef shoe type things, or you can just go barefoot and hold your shoes and then put them on after you've gone onto the dry land. And then we do have the audio equipment on board as well for that clear commentary, so you don't miss out on anything our expedition lead is having to say along the way. Now, we also have our Zodiacs, which are really cool. So the inflatable Zodiacs, they just provide another exciting and flexible option for shore excursions and navigating some narrow inlets and waterways that the explorer tenders might not be able to get into. So they're also a great way to get close to nature, and we will use the Zodiacs wherever possible. Now, the ships. So all of our ships, they are purpose built for expedition cruising. So they have shallow drafts and high movability. So we can get you to those places that a lot of larger vessels can't. All our vessels are Australian flagged and Australian New Zealand crew, which means we can spend more time in domestic waters on our domestic voyages. We have the best local knowledge, and we don't need to spend your valuable time travelling into international waters like many foreign lines do. All of our rooms are outward facing, so you don't miss out on the view, and they are set up for twin share. However, we do have the option for sole use as well. So this is Coral Adventurer. Now, Coral Adventurer started operating in 2019, so fairly new. Has 60 state rooms and a maximum of 120 passengers. So very familiar design across all 3 of our ships. However, for our South Australia coastline, it will be on board this one, Coral Adventurer, or her sister ship, Coral Geographer, which we'll have a look at next. So on board Coral Adventurer, there's 2 large 55 square metre suites on board and a lovely range of indoor and outdoor dining and seating areas to enjoy all those spectacular views along South Australia's coastline. Now, this is Coral Geographer, so newer again, so delivered in March 2021, so our newest ship to the fleet. Again, has 60 staterooms with a maximum of 120 passengers. So this ship has 6 suites on board and a lift that goes up to the Vista Bar on the top deck. But as I mentioned before, all of our rooms are outward facing, so everybody gets a view from their room, and you'll never miss out on those spectacular sunsets and sunrises and all the other things you're going to see along the way. Great. So now for the exciting part. So I'm going to hand over to Quentin Chester, who's one of our guest speakers today, and he's one of our guest lecturers on board a lot of our ships. So thanks for joining us today, Quentin, and he's going to talk all things South Australia and the southern coastline as he's the expert. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Gabby, and great to have everybody along today, and a lovely rundown of all of the things that make coral expedition special with the ships and the tenders and so on. So yeah, it's a great system.
Thanks, Quentin. So we'll get you to tell us a bit about yourself, and then we'll go on to the itineraries.
Okay, so my background, I'm a writer by trade. I've worked for magazines and written books over the years. I've worked for Australian Geographic quite a lot. I've been there since 1986, in fact, working for Australian Geographic. And part of my interest is coastlines and islands. Together with Alistair McGregor, I wrote a book about the wild islands of Australia back in nearly 20 years ago now. And so part of my kind of interest in life is sharing the story of some of these places which are not quite so well known, still part of our wonderful Australian coastline, but they're often just a little bit beyond the reach of people on the mainland in terms of they can't even see it perhaps from the shores of the mainland. And these are places which are not often inhabited or visited, but they all have a special story to tell. And that's part of really what we're trying to do with these trips along the southern coastline is bring to life some of that landform and some of the geology, some of the wildlife, and the Southern Ocean, which is the real maker and breaker of all things in the southern part of Australia. A very powerful force in our life down here. I'm talking to you from Kangaroo Island, where we have the southern coast here, which is shaped by the power of the Southern Ocean, and it brings a lot of very interesting wildlife to our shores.
Great, thanks, Quentin. All right. So we'll start with the Wild Islands of South Australia 10-night itinerary, Adelaide to Adelaide, which departs November and December this year, or October and November next year.
Yes, so this one is an interesting mix of coastal areas that on the mainland, and then a lot of island habitats that we do visit. We come to Kangaroo Island first up, and come to our backyard here at Chamber Bay. And we visit the very famous lighthouse at Cape Willoughby. But the whole trip sort of weaves its way through the Gulf waters of South Australia, on the northern side of Kangaroo Island, then up into Spencer Gulf, and then around to the west coast of Eyre Peninsula. And it's a very interesting experience, particularly as we get further west. These are places that very few people get to. And Coral is one of the very few cruise ships that even get anywhere near some of these islands and destinations. So it's a very special part of the whole itinerary. So yes, Cape Willoughby, and this is one of my photographs that I took, and this is my place of employment. I spend some time here doing some guiding. Once I've finished this webinar, I'll be up there showing people through the maritime history of this site. So this is the oldest lighthouse in South Australia, and one of the oldest in Australia. It's a real pioneer. And we, as part of our itinerary on the Wild Islands, we get to see this lighthouse. Those who want to can climb to the top of the tower there and enjoy this spectacular view of the island itself, of Kangaroo Island, but also, as you can see on the horizon in the mist there, the mainland of Australia. So it's a wonderful coastal bit of scenery and a lot of history there. This is the lighthouse that looks after all the ships bound for South Australia, coming from the east, heading into the Gulf waters. So we have a good morning or afternoon there, depending on what our schedule is, as part of our time on the eastern end of the island. And around the island, we have many pods of dolphins and all sorts of other wildlife that we see. We don't sail on this trip during the whale season, unfortunately. That's during winter, and it's probably a little bit tricky for some people navigating these waters in winter. But certainly in the spring and autumn times that we sometimes use the ships down here, we see dolphins, we see seals, we see lots of schools of fish, occasionally maybe a small shark, but they're pretty rare to see. But certainly the dolphins love the bay. And on the island itself, and on the other islands, we see quite a lot of seabirds and also terrestrial life, lots of rock wallabies, mammals. On Kangaroo Island, we've got both kangaroos and Tamar wallabies. And depending on the weather and what the animals are doing, we often encounter those on some of our shorter walks. And we do see some of the shorebirds and woodland birds as we're walking around through the parks and reserves.
Oops, sorry, Quentin, it's just going a bit slow. There we go.
And a big feature of the trip, as you can imagine, in South Australia, we're famous for our food and wine, and particularly our seafood. And Port Lincoln, which is one of the regions on the southern end of Eyre Peninsula, is very famous for its seafood. And just to the west of Port Lincoln is Coffin Bay, and we do spend some time there, and we meet with some of the growers of oysters in Coffin Bay. They will tell you it's the best oyster growing region in the world. We don't disagree with them when we're there, but it's certainly a wonderful opportunity, and you can see the very special environment about Coffin Bay in terms of how the ocean circulates through that wonderful bay and keeps the oysters incredibly fresh and tasty. And we either go out into the leases and spend time with the oyster growers. Sometimes they come aboard the ship and do a presentation for us. Just depends on the circumstances at the time and what our schedule is. But we certainly get to taste and enjoy these wonderful, wonderful oysters and other seafood from the local environment. And over on Flinders Island, we have a very special opportunity to meet with the Woolford brothers, Tobin and Jonas. The Woolford family have owned Flinders Island for many decades now. Their background, they're abalone divers, and they also used to run sheep on Flinders Island, but they're doing a big change over there. They're looking at rehabilitating the whole island for nature and wildlife. And the boys, these brothers, they're wonderful characters, and they spend a lot of time in the water diving for abalone. They're one of our premier abalone diving operations in South Australia. And they meet us on the island, and we get a chance to have a good old taste of the abalone. And they take us through the history of the island, and we often meet their families as well. Both the boys have got lovely young children who often on the beach helping us to savour the abalone. So it's a real family show. And for a lot of Australians, abalone is not something they're used to having, but it is an interesting experience, and often it's prepared in a variety of ways. And I think the Woolford brothers, over the course of our voyages, have won a few converts to abalone as part of our wonderful seafood we have. So that's another kind of tasty aspect to our trip, as well as seeing all of the wonderful scenery and coastline. We do get into the real flavours of the environment, and that's a product of that wonderful Southern Ocean, a very clean, nutrient-rich ocean, which drives the food chain and keeps us going with all our lovely fish and prawns and lobsters and abalone and oysters. So we're a bit spoiled for our seafood down here. And as well as all of that good food and wine, we do get out and enjoy the landscape, and we do quite a lot of walks on this trip. So, and we do normally a shorter option of walks, and then a slightly longer walk that we do. And when we go ashore, and this can be beach combing, we can be walking along cliff tops to viewing points. And that's a chance, we build up our appetite. We can get back into the ship and have more seafood. So it's a good excuse to get out and stretch the legs. And we're very fortunate in South Australia. We've got all these islands. There's over 300 islands here. And a lot of the coastline is very natural. This is out on the Coffin Bay Peninsula on this image at Point Sir Isaac, a very remote place. You have to be a pretty keen four-wheel drive person to get there overland. But we can access it by the ship, and they have these wonderful beaches and bays that we can explore. And we take you through the history of these regions, both from an Indigenous point of view, clearly with all of this wonderful marine habitat and seafood and marine life. It was a rich habitat for people in the Eyre Peninsula region, historically for Indigenous groups. And then obviously during the days of European exploration, navigating these shores was a real challenge. And so Point Sir Isaac references one of Matthew Flinders' benefactors, if you like, for his voyage on the Investigator back in 1802. So we tie together a lot of different threads with the history of these places, and that gives Australians a real sense of the journey that we have been on as a nation, and as it's reflected in even some of these more remote places. And back on Kangaroo Island here, this is just in our local park, just down the road from where I'm talking to you. And it's a wonderful wetland environment with lovely forest and woodland and a beautiful long sandy beach that we can wander as well. And so we try to mix the itinerary around. So at different times, we'll be getting into some more secluded bushland environments where we can go walking. A lot of great bird life in this vegetation. And Kangaroo Island's a very special place, not just for kangaroos and wallabies, but also for small woodland birds. We've got wonderful habitat for them. We often see eagles and birds of prey as well. But it's a real kind of immersive experience in that bushland environment. And in November, we still have some of the spring flowers and the spring vegetation that are present in this woodland. So lots of great walks. And it's very straightforward. Usually the walking is often very much along sandy ground. Occasionally we get into some rockier terrain, but normally being South Australia, we don't have, soaring mountain peaks to climb. We've got a lot of nice rolling country and some fairly flat islands. So you're not having to kind of put on your climbing boots to get along the walks. They're often very gentle in terms of their altitude gain. So it's a nice, easygoing kind of experience. Bit of a sip of water. So Cape Donington, which is on the Lincoln National Park, this is on the tip of Eyre Peninsula, and we have a whole range of walks there. There's about, I think, 70 kilometres of walking trail that we can choose from, and that depends on the weather and how people are feeling in terms of their physical ability. So we can chop and change, but we can get to see coastline on both sides of the peninsula, on Lincoln National Park near Port Lincoln there, and we go out to the lighthouse that's at Cape Donington. Not quite as pretty as my Cape Willoughby lighthouse, but still an important lighthouse. And this is a very protected environment. Once you get inside the shelter of this peninsula in Lincoln National Park, we do have some hills to climb, and probably the only mountain we climb, to call it a mountain is probably being a bit of an exaggeration, but it's a good hill called Stamford Hill. And we have some good walks there. We get to see great views of Boston Harbour, Boston Bay, and the islands there. And it is quite of a very special place. And that's a good option for us in terms of the shelter that peninsula affords us. And our sea lion friends. So one of the highlights for us as guest lecturers on board is the opportunity to showcase all sorts of wildlife. And one of the real endearing characters that we meet on our journey are the sea lions. These are Australia's only indigenous marine mammal on the southern side of the continent. So these are a true Aussie sea lion, and they're very entertaining to spend time with. We don't necessarily go ashore where they are. We're going to all of these islands in the Spencer Gulf where these sea lions spend time, and often will be in the tender, in the explorers, and these young sea lions, these are sort of the teenagers, if you like, in the family structure. They're very inquisitive and curious, and they'll often come out to meet us. And the image on the top right of that set there is showing you a couple of the sea lions coming to have a look at us. So it's very entertaining, and we have a lot of information to share about these animals, their life story, their biology. They're a fascinating animal to study, and we get a lot of opportunities to see them at different times during the itinerary, particularly on that Eyre Peninsula section of the trip. And they are an endangered animal, so there's some serious conservation biology that we can talk about as well. But essentially, it's just a real thrill. We come off the ship and we head around some of the smaller islands, and we do know where some of these colonies are based, and so we often get a chance for these animals to come out and meet us. And it's another good point that if you do come on a trip like this, it is worth bringing along a pair of binoculars, because you do pick up extra kind of information and opportunities to see wildlife with a pair of binoculars. And as I say, they do come quite close to us, but you will see a lot more with a nice pair of binoculars. Gabby's doing her magic work here. There we go. And back to Cape Willoughby, and these are Kangaroo Island kangaroos, and Kangaroo Island's very famous for these big macropods. These are a subspecies of the western grey kangaroo, very different in terms of their colour, a much darker, thicker coat of fur, and slightly different faces. And the animals at Cape Willoughby, as an example, are a little bit used to having people wandering by. So if they see us, we don't go right up to them, obviously. There's no patting wildlife or anything like that, but the animals are often very relaxed in our presence. And so for a lot of people, it's a really great opportunity to see the animals and see kangaroos in a coastal environment. We often see them bounding along the open plains, but this is a population of kangaroos which occupies all the different habitats on the island, and particularly the coastline. We often see them on the beaches here, as they do in Western Australia. So it's kind of a fun concept that you're doing a bit of a walk, and there's a kangaroo standing by the ocean.
Speaking of wildlife by the ocean.
Yeah, indeed. And this is out on the Coffin Bay Peninsula, near Coffin Bay there, and big sand dune formations. And this is very much one of the great places to see emus in the wild in South Australia. And it's very common to see them on the coast, on the beach, in the water even. We do some walks here, and we often see, in an emu world, the dads do all of the sort of major parenting, really. So I often see dad with some young chicks, and it's a real lot of fun. I mean, we see emus obviously in other parts of Australia, but again, to see an animal that's sort of adapted its lifestyle to live by the sea and in the sand dunes is quite a bit of fun, and they're very entertaining to watch. I've already mentioned Matthew Flinders, and he's a real hero of our story, particularly because of the struggles and the triumphs, if you like, as well, that they had in South Australia. So when he came in 1802, this stretch of coastline, really from Western Australia through to the border with Victoria, was unknown. So he was the first really to chart a lot of this coastline, and we follow in his footsteps. And there's a lot of great storytelling that we can share with you about the challenges they faced. I mean, this was incredibly brave and courageous sailing back in the day in this very remote part of the world. And Matthew was a brilliant navigator and produced some wonderful information, excellent charts of the coastline of South Australia. But he really had some major challenges here. They had a very unfortunate accident off Eyre Peninsula where they lost 7 of their men in a small boating accident. And there's quite a heartrending story about that. But then by the time they got to Kangaroo Island, they were back into good spirits and having a very entertaining time there. And we love to share that very significant history. And often, obviously, Matthew Flinders is well known for his adventures in other parts of Australia, but really it was in South Australia that he did some of his finest work. And that's something we can celebrate as we go around some of the places that he dropped anchor. And there is the opportunity to spend a lot of time on the beach. We do set up occasionally a beach day where we've got kayaks and opportunity for people to swim, even do a bit of snorkeling if they're interested in that. But depending on the weather and how people are feeling, we've got a number of beaches where, you can just happily have a swim. And we do have the kayaks on board, both the Adventurer and the Geographer. And for a lot of people who enjoy kayaking and boating, that's a really fun activity, just as a bit of variety from the other things that we do. And the beaches are very pristine almost. In most cases, we've got these wonderful white sand beaches, quartzite beaches, and very clean, clear water. It is a bit chillier than a lot of people perhaps are used to, but on a good warm day in November or December, it's a very refreshing opportunity for people who enjoy being in the water. And for those who don't want to swim, there's of course the opportunity to beach comb and explore, and we get a lot of interesting things on the water's edge there. A lot of great marine life that's washed up, shells and so on. So our guest lecturers and expedition team will be able to help interpret some of that material that we do encounter on the beach. And one of the other real highlights for me personally is the opportunity with the ship, as well as the tender, to explore some of the less well-known or less visited parts of the islands on the coastline of South Australia. And we go to, pardon me, islands like Wedge Island and Althorpe Island, and then the Pearson Island group, the investigator group, out on the west coast. And these are very wild, rugged places, and very few people get to see the seaward side of the islands. These are shaped by the Southern Ocean, and these are some of the biggest sea cliffs in Australia. Some of them are over 300 metres, 400 metres in elevation, and they're very spectacular. And that's a real highlight. A lot of people from South Australia have heard about places like Wedge Island or Althorpe Island, but with the ship and these wonderful expedition ships, we have the opportunity to enjoy that experience from the deck of the ship. And the captains are very skilled with bringing the ships in around these islands and giving us that kind of interpretation of that landscape. And I really value this as part of the experience because, again, this is something that very few people get to see. And it's only because of the experience we have and the capabilities of these ships that we can get in this close to some of the islands.
Thanks, Quentin. So we've got our other two South Australia's coastline itineraries now. So as you're aware, Quentin, these have a similar itinerary, but a few points of differences. So we'll run through across the Great Australian Bight itinerary, which is 13 nights from Fremantle to Adelaide, which departs in October. And then we also have Australia's Great Southern Coastline, which is 14 nights, but departs from Melbourne to Fremantle, and that is in February 2024.
Yes, well, these are real spectacular journeys, that big span of southern coastline. And some people say that Australia has the longest south-facing coastline in the world. And when you travel on either of these itineraries, you really get a sense of that scale of southern Australia and the power of the Southern Ocean, because it's expressed all along the coast in these wonderful cliffs and islands, these big long beaches, and of course the cliffs along the Nullarbor. And this wonderful part of Cape Naturalist, Pyramid Rock here, just a really beautiful place to enjoy. And Western Australia, a bit like South Australia, has got some very old geology on the coast, these old granites, and then around it also limestone, which is a much younger rock in general terms. And this combination of old and young geology gives you a big variety in terms of the formations that we see and the sort of colours and textures. So it's sort of an interesting piece of sculpture, natural sculpture, if you like, to travel on these itineraries and see that the different geology revealed as we go along. And in Western Australia, we see a lot of fantastic granite coastlines. We had granite at Cape Willoughby we were talking about there, but here it's right around this peninsula, the southwest of WA, and along that southern coast, from Esperance right through to Albany, and around up here to Cape Naturalist. So there's a lot to see and enjoy, and there's a lot of excursions that we do which take in these wonderful formations as well. So as part of the Melbourne to Fremantle itinerary, we spend some time in the coastlines of Victoria, a very famous 12 Apostles, and we also visit Apollo Bay, Port Fairy. So these are very historic towns. Port Fairy is a wonderful place. We were there as part of a voyage last November, and the locals were very welcoming and friendly. A very historic port town with a lot of history still intact in the township itself, and a very great story to enjoy there. And along this coastline in southern Victoria, we have both that geology I was talking about, but also the wildlife. Just near Port Fairy is the largest colony of Australian fur seals that we have on one of the islands there. So we often encounter those on this bit of the coast. And of course, the very famous limestone formations along that 12 Apostle shipwreck coast, as they call it. We don't get in too close. There is a little bit of a zone that we have to be protective of. We don't come right in hard, but we certainly on these voyages get within good sort of visibility distance of the 12 Apostles. And again, it all depends on the weather and the conditions. But when we were there in November last year, we had a whole. It's not just like a brief glimpse. This coastline is being unfolding as you go over a couple of hours, 2 or 3 hours. And that opportunity to see that whole stretch of the coastline is very special. Obviously, a lot of people travel the Great Ocean Road and get to see the Apostles from the different lookouts. But to see it from the ocean is incredibly special. And again, you can take in that whole vista from the comfort of the ship. There's been binoculars, and a lot of people spend time up on the outer decks. We have an open bridge policy normally on the ship, so you can even go up and see how the watch captain is dealing with the navigation. So it is a very special opportunity, and I really enjoyed our visit in November. It was something that we kind of had some great weather, I guess, too, but it was something that I wasn't expecting to be quite so moving in a way, because it is an iconic bit of Australia. And on this itinerary, these two itineraries coming across from the south, we do make our visit to Kangaroo Island and enjoy Cape Willoughby and the wildlife around Kangaroo Island. So that's a nice contrast to that more exposed coastline that we're talking about in Victoria. We come into Port Fairy and enjoy the hospitality there. And then Kangaroo Island gives us a chance to get on shore and stretch our legs, do a bit of walking, get up to the lighthouse and enjoy the history there. So a nice mix of activities over that first few days from Melbourne. And on both these Southern Australia trips, we come around onto the southwestern tip of WA there, and Hamilton Bay is a very well-known place, both for its fishing and swimming and so on, but it has this incredible population of stingrays and eagle rays. And my wife Dar was there on one of the coral ships last year, and she loves getting into the water. And these stingrays weren't sort of coming up too close, but they were coming within just like 2 or 3 meters of where you were standing in the water. And so that sense of being in a wild place with animals which essentially are happy to go about their business, they're not kind of freaked out by us being there. It's kind of a nice thing to have in your day is that kind of sense of contact or interest with wildlife. And this is one of the great highlights of that part of the coast, is that whole coastal precinct around Hamilton Bay. And again, on these trips, we do make our visit to Coffin Bay. We can't go past there. The locals won't let us go past without calling in to try the oysters. And as we mentioned earlier, it is a wonderful opportunity, and you get to speak to the actual growers. It's not just a bit of an oyster tasting. You get to talk about what makes that particular region so significant in terms of how the waters move through the bay, and the cleanliness of the waters, and the history of farming oysters there. It gives a whole personal dimension to what is otherwise just a wonderful kind of taste sensation. But you really appreciate the work that goes into putting these oysters on our dinner plates. And again, the Flinders Island abalone experience, which has always been very popular. We started these itineraries in Flinders Island back in, I think, February 2021. And from the first moment we were on the island, we just knew we had a wonderful experience to share with people. And the Wolford family were very welcoming and just very natural kind of Aussie family. Very relaxed, but very knowledgeable as well. They're quite smart operators in how they manage the whole abalone fishery. It's a very sustainable and lucrative operation they have. So, yeah, it's a really interesting insight again, both for the kind of the taste and biology of these abalone, but also the personal family stories that are involved. And of course, Margaret River, our eldest daughter's a winemaker, so we have spent some time in Margaret River when she's been visiting there, and it's one of the great Australian wine regions. Just a fantastic place, and the variety of wines that they can grow there in this wonderful corner of Australia is something that we like to share as part of our itinerary, and that's a feature of a lot of the coral trips in Tasmania. We're often enjoying Tasmanian wines and South Australian wines. And as we get to WA, we get to sample the local produce. And we're very fortunate in Australia to have this huge range of both local food and local wine, and the opportunity to match those together in creative ways is part of the whole experience we have on board, you know. So the adventure doesn't just stop when we get back to the ship. We're even in the dining room, we're still exploring all these things. And here down at Cape Leeuwin, famous lighthouse here where the two oceans meet, both the Southern Ocean, Indian Ocean come together at this wonderful corner of Australia. And a bit like Cape York, this is an iconic part of the continent, and a lot of people have it on their bucket list to get to Cape Leeuwin. And this is a very nice day at Cape Leeuwin. It can be pretty wild down there, but that's all part of the excitement when the storms are coming through. And you can see how exposed it is to the Southern Ocean here, with these big slabs of granite which have been weathered by the passage of time and the ocean swells, and this wonderful low vegetation that sweeps around the coastline going north up towards Cape Naturalist. Lovely heath vegetation, and there is the famous Cape to Cape walk, which goes from Cape Leeuwin up to Cape Naturalist. So these are iconic parts of Australia, and we get obviously a chance to sample a little bit of that whole landscape and environment as part of our journey to Fremantle. And there she is, fantastic tower. I'm a bit of a lighthouse enthusiast, so this is a very special lighthouse in Australian history. Not one of the oldest, but certainly one of the tallest. It's, I think, the tallest on the mainland of Australia, nearly 50 metres tall, the tower. And over the last 2 years, they've been renovating the lighthouse, so fixing up the outside and the inside. And as of this year, they've been able to take people up to the top again. So this is, again, a real landmark. So we visit Cape York on our itineraries and often have sunset drinks here at Cape York, but the chance to bring coral ships down here is another real landmark experience. There's fantastic interpretation here, really good local guides, sort of lighthouse specialists. There's, you know, a lovely museum as well. So it's a very special part of the itinerary. And when you sailed from somewhere like Melbourne or Adelaide to Augusta to Cape Leeuwin here, you really appreciate the value of lighthouses, because, you know, it is a very wild coast. And, you know, even though lighthouses are a kind of insurance backup navigation system now, they still play an important part. And you can only imagine for ships in the late 19th century what the building of these lighthouses meant. It was a very powerful breakthrough for sailors and navigators. And we talked about the limestone, and we get right into it on some of the caves here on the whole southwestern corner of WA. It's just a powerhouse of a place. On the top, there's these big forests, wonderful karri forests and jarrah, big forests on top, and then underneath this limestone cap over the granite are these tremendous caves, and these are some of the most spectacular and accessible caves in Australia, and just a wonderful experience to share. And again, great local guides here and interp that we can enjoy, and a real kind of variety of things. When you think, 1 minute you're top of a lighthouse and next minute you're underground, so there's no shortage of diversity on what we can offer here. And this is a real part of that story of the evolution of the continent, the formation of the limestone, and then over many millions of years, how the caves have formed through natural processes, and these very spectacular limestone formations. They're always very eye-catching, and I really love being in this kind of thing. It's on a rainy day, there's no better place than a cave. And yes, another one of these areas of the coastline of southern Australia, which very few people get to see, the archipelago of the Surge. There's hundreds and hundreds of islands here, and this is again, very few people in Australia have been out to these islands. They're quite hard to access in terms of their physical shorelines are very challenging to get onto. They're very wild places. There's very few people living out here. In fact, I don't think there's any real permanent residents on most of the islands. So we get a chance to go ashore on Woody Island and do a bit of a walking experience and sample some of the natural habitat here. But there's just this wonderful spread of islands just off Esperance. And to see that from the ship again is a very special moment. We do have an opportunity to get ashore here and experience some of the bird life, which is unique to this archipelago. And there's always a chance here of seeing both sea lions and other marine life, dolphins. In winter, obviously, there's whales in this habitat, but they're not normally around at the time that we're sailing, just for, they're often off down south feeding in the Antarctic. But you can see and imagine as you're sailing these waters how dramatic it is when the whales are through here. It's a very special place. And Lucky Bay, this is an iconic part of Australia now, really, courtesy of a lot of the photography that's been done on the shoreline here. This is just near Esperance, these wonderful turquoise waters and beautiful white sand beaches where the kangaroos seem to congregate. We've got a few places in Australia where the kangaroos are real beach enthusiasts, and this is one of them. And it's just a special bay. It's part of the Matthew Flinders story. It's so lucky because they went in there without really knowing. They were looking for somewhere to anchor, and they were very fortunate to find this bay and not hit any rocks on their way in. So that's why it's got that name. But it's lucky for us in the sense that it's accessible for our tenders. We can get you onto the beach here and go for a walk and hopefully spot a couple of young kangaroos on the sand. And you don't get more Aussie than that.
Wow, Quentin, that was amazing. Thank you. I mean, you've got wildlife on the beach, some of Australia's hidden secrets, wine, seafood. What more could you want? Sounds amazing.
It's the best of all worlds, really.
That's it. And how lucky are you to live down there?
Yeah, well, I enjoy coming up. I guide in the Kimberley with Coral as well. But the opportunity now that's really evolved over the last 5 years to do some of these itineraries down south, and the model that Coral have with their tenders and the size of the vessels they have, it really translates beautifully into this environment. We have to be a bit flexible about the itineraries because of weather and so on, but generally speaking, we can fit things together to create a very memorable experience. And the Great Australian Bight is an iconic kind of part of the world for Australia. The biggest limestone expanse on the Nullarbor there. We do visit on one of those itineraries. We do go up to the Bunda Cliffs, And that's just, this mind-blowing wall of limestone,
Yeah.
which goes for dozens of kilometres. And for a lot of people, even just the experience of seeing that with their own eyes from the ship is very special.
Yeah, incredible part of the world, that's for sure. So we're just going to go into some questions now. If anybody does have any questions you wanted to ask in relation to these voyages, you can just pop them in the chat section, sorry, and we will do our best to answer those now. And if we don't have a chance to get to them, we will email you back with a written response. Or if you think of something later, you can see the reservations contact details on the screen there. So explore@coralexpeditions.com, send them an email or give them a call. And to check availability and pricing and things like that, to get a bit more information, you can just jump on the Coral Expeditions website, where we do have live availability on there. But just while we're waiting for a few questions to come through, Quentin, what can you tell us about the weather that we can expect travelling on those voyages at that time of year, around the October, November, December time frame?
Well, it's variable is always the word to use
Yeah.
in terms of the weather down here. We get a lot of variety on our trips. So typically in November, you in a week or 10 days or whatever journey you're on, you'll have you will have some wild weather. There'll be 2 or 3 days of quite windy weather, but then we'll often have 3 or 4 days when it settles down and we have beautiful sunshine. So we get to see the different moods, which I think is all part of the experience. In March, I was going around Tasmania on the Coral Discoverer, and we had some really spectacular weather, where these beautiful cloud formations in the sky, some very dramatic kind of conditions, and I think that's all part of the kind of mix of things we do. So in November, for instance, down here on Kangaroo Island, we're talking about daytime temperatures in the sort of low 20s. We can get up into the sort of mid 20s on a warmer day, but it's rare for it to get sort of super hot in November here. And then the nighttime temperatures are pretty mild. I mean, we only drop down to probably 14 degrees or so at night. So it's not like we're in the Arctic or the Antarctic or anything, but you will need, if you're coming on one of these, to have a variety of clothes to cope with all these different these weather conditions. We had some spectacular weather in Coffin Bay at the end of last year, which was very dramatic. We had this electrical storm. We're all safely on the ship. It wasn't a dangerous situation at all. But again, to see that weather from the comfort and security of the ships is all part of the experience.
Yeah, wow. And we did mention that there'll be some wet and dry landings, especially with all those beautiful coastal areas. Is there, in your opinion, some footwear that you would recommend that people take?
Yes, generally some sort of reasonably sturdy beach sandal, not flip flops or thongs, because they're not quite so robust and they'd have a habit of flying off. But something which has got a bit of a strap around the heel that is sort of secure on the foot.
Yeah.
There are some situations where we can just step ashore in bare feet, but often we'll encourage and ask people to wear some kind of footwear, because if you're stepping into slightly deeper water, and we sometimes have to wade, at sort of just below the knee sort of depth of water, you're not quite sure. Sometimes it could be a sharp shell or a rock in the water. So it's always good to have some sort of footwear on board, just to cope with that situation. And then often what we do if we're going for walks is there's the chance to change into proper walking footwear once we get onto the beach, and we have towels and a moment to change our shoes. So it just depends, but I would always encourage people to wear something on their feet, just because you don't know what's sort of tucked away in that sand. You don't want to get a cut or a bruise early in the trip or something like that.
No, that's for sure. Now we do provide beach towels. I've just had someone ask that question. So we do have them on board, but you can just check with the staff. They can give you one of those. But if you do prefer to take your own beach towel, you're more than welcome to. And we've had another question in regards to water. So we do have a water refill station on board our ships as well. And we provide everyone with a personalised aluminium drink bottle in your staterooms as well. So you'll get one of those and can keep hydrated on all those shore excursions. But apart from that, that's all the questions that we've had today. Again, if anyone has anything else, just reach out to our reservations team. We'd be happy to answer those for you. And I'd just like to say thank you so much, Quentin. You've been so knowledgeable today, and it's really good to get your insight onto the South Australia's beautiful coastline.
Oh, thanks, Gabby. No, always happy to talk about our part of the world down here.
Yeah, spectacular spot. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We will send out a recorded version to everybody today that's registered. I know there was a few latecomers, so don't worry if you missed the beginning. We can recap you on all of that with the recording. We do have another webinar coming up next week. If anyone's interested, that will be on Thursday, the 4th of May at 3 o'clock Queensland time. And we'll have the lovely Ian Burnett as our guest speaker, talking all about the islands of the East Indies, which is pretty exciting. So thanks again, everyone, and we look forward to talking with you soon. Thanks, Quentin.
Thanks, Gabby. Bye-bye.
Bye.